Okay, welcome back. Let's do section two. I've divided this chapter by the New Deal and then what they call the second New Deal. So let me turn the slide here. So the second New Deal was when FDR, he was kind of looking at things. Unemployment really hadn't gone down. The situation really hadn't changed very much. So they decided that they were going to launch all these new programs. And this is where we're going to get some really big ones, like the Social Security, National Labor Relations Act, Fair Labor Standards Act, just all sorts of them, right? So this one focused more on reform. And you can see the main things there that are still in place today: Social Security, National Labor Relations, and Fair Labor Standards Act. If you look over here, this political cartoon, FDR, he's just wanting more and more power, according to some people, the person who made this, right? All right, so in 1935, too, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, and so the National Recovery Administration were ruled unconstitutional. And it was in what they call the Sick Chicken Act, or the Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States. So this company was fined. It was a company in Pennsylvania. It was fined for selling quote unquote sick chickens. So it was buying chickens from like New York, and they were in Pennsylvania, but it was selling just within its own state. So anyway, they were fined by the National Recovery Association, right? Well, they challenged it. It went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court came down with a unanimous ruling that it was unconstitutional based on two principles. The first one here is that what the company did, um, that was a violation was done within the state of Pennsylvania. It wasn't going from state to state. So therefore, it didn't, Congress couldn't regulate anything that was intra-state, only interstate, right? So that was one. The other thing they said, and this was probably bigger, is that it violated the separations of powers clause of Article 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution, because basically the President of the United States and his administration is writing the law. So they can't do that, because that's only up to Congress to make the laws, right? Also, the executive was legislating just by creating the National Recovery Administration, and that the term unfair competition was too ambiguous. So they ruled it unconstitutional. Okay, so here are some of the things that they did. Over here, infrastructure, these things: roads, schools, airports, right? Public toilets. But then this is what people called boondoggling, right? Sweeping leaves, acting in a play. Here, hiring 100 people to scare off pigeons in Washington, D.C. I suppose that you need to do that. I don't know. But anyway, I like this cartoon. If you look at it, the only thing we have to fear is work itself, according to this. So there's a guys standing all around just talking to one another, and then there's one guy just, he's shoveling and working and doing everything. Then down below it says it's his first day. He's certainly making a blank of himself, right? So this came out in February 1938. So later on in the New Deal. Okay, so then that organization, Civil Works Administration, becomes the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. And I have a really weird liking for this too. You can go around the country in some places and you could see a stamp on sidewalks and it'll say WPA. So it has its mark in various locations throughout the United States. So again, part of the second New Deal. It's in response to a lot of criticism that's going on. It's not working. So this was a way to put more people to work, right? So they did useful projects right here. Again, a lot of the same things: streets, sewers, parks, playgrounds, airfields, schools, but then also a lot of arts projects. So people were putting on plays. There were artists painting, people writing, doing murals, sculptures, all sorts of things. It kept American arts alive, what many people believe. Some people thought, though, this is just a political machine, a way to get you pandering for votes, right? It becomes the Works Projects Administration in 1939, but it keeps the same acronym. Okay, so the person who ran this was Harry Hopkins, the Secretary of Commerce. Work relief preserves a man's morale, it saves his skill, it gives him a chance to do something socially useful. So Harry Hopkins, as the Secretary of Commerce, he ran the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Civil Works Administration, and then the WPA. He disagreed, he and Harold Ickes kind of disagreed on how, because what they did really overlapped. They kind of were doing the same thing, only differently. Right? The questioning, how do we put Americans back to work, right? So here's Harry Hopkins on the left and Harold Ickes on the right. This political cartoon, the one over here with the glasses, that's Harold Ickes, right? He is the Secretary of the Interior, and here Harold Hopkins right here. So you can see his coat. I think it's like tax, 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 tax. You know, the big check suit that was hung on Harry, and so it's just tax. It says, although Hopkins denied saying it, spend, 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 tax, 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 elect, elect, elect. Conservative critics thought the slogan fit the New Deal very well because they thought that people in the New Deal were just pandering to the people. I'm going to give you a job, you vote for our administration. Okay, so here are some things that were created from the WPA that we have an appreciation for today. The one on the left, this is in St. Louis at Forest Park, not far from the zoo there. It's beautiful. And then, of course, the Riverwalk in San Antonio on the top. That's a bridge there. And then down below, this is City Hall in Osceola, Arkansas. Building looks familiar. That building looks familiar. It looks just like our post office. It is. Our post office was also built by the WPA. Okay, and then this, I remember as a kid going into the post office in Galesburg. We lived there. That's where I graduated from high school. My dad grew up there. We go into the post office. I always remember looking at that mural thinking, wow, that is so cool. And then later I learned that it was it was done during the WPA. Okay, this here, a mosaic too, at a lodge in Oregon, also done. That's a WPA piece of art. And then lots of posters, right? This one, Forging Ahead, this was a poster for the WPA by the WPA, right? This one over here, Health Notice, syphilis, 6 out of 10 cured because they did not wait too long. And then one over here on the right for the arts, poster for the arts. Poster for reading, right? A public service announcement for tourism, travel to Puerto Rico, part of the United States. I love the one on the left. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, some students gave me a poster, a reproduction of this. So this was a WPA poster on the left for the University of Illinois cattle feeders meeting. And then the one on the right, Christmas carols. This style of art on the right, that is Art Deco. As I mentioned to you last chapter, Art Deco was a really popular art form in the 1920s and into the 1930s as well. Okay, and then when World War II starts up, then the artists for the WPA are also doing posters for the war propaganda. Okay, there's also the Federal Housing Administration. This is one of the first FHA insured homes in 1934, 1935. And what it did is it gave out small loans so that people could either purchase or buy homes. Later, it was also became the United States Housing Authority, and what this did is it which helped the Federal Housing Administration. If you are low income today, you can go and you can get an FHA loan. That's still around today, so you can do that to buy your first house. Okay, and then in 1935, this was created, the Social Security Administration. So what FDR did is created something to where people, there'd be protection for them in their old age. Think about people in the Great Depression, if they were elderly and they didn't have any savings, or their savings was in a bank and the bank closed down, then they had nothing. They'd have to depend upon either welfare, charitable contributions, or family members, right? So the payments initially were only $10 to $85, and it was financed through a payroll tax. So the people who first got it, they didn't pay into it. It's the people who had to pay that tax, and it was sold as an insurance. Then that comes out of your paycheck. Everybody gets an identification number, so you have a social security number. So people pay into it, and then you get it beginning at age 65, right? I think that they have increased the age for that. I'm not sure. But more and more Americans are living longer, right? We're living up until 100. When at the time they didn't expect people to live that long. So there are more people who are retired than working. And so some people think that it's going to collapse. I doubt that it will. Somehow they're going to work to fund it. I don't know how. Okay, and then there's this. This is huge. This is the National Labor Relations Act. Well, of course, the Social Security Act is huge. And I meant to say that you get it if you're elderly, if you're disabled somehow, if you are like a dependent of somebody who has passed away, or somebody who should have received a pension, that sort of thing. But anyway, this National Labor Relations Act is also known as the Wagner Act, and this is huge for labor, right? It's spelled out for the first time that people had the right to organize into a union. You could be in a union, you could collectively bargain, and you couldn't be penalized for going on strike. So you could go on strike, right? So what it created also was the National Labor Relations Board. So this is a group of people who mediate between labor and management and the business leaders to do that. So what we have, the president gets to appoint 5 members to the board, and then there are regional directors around the country who go out and investigate and help to regulate or mediate between labor and management. All right, so this is the Congress of Industrial Organizations. It's not a federal organization. Remember, in the past, the only labor union that had been able to really have any sort of power was the American Federation of Labor, because they had skilled labor. This is the first time what we're going to get is non-skilled labor. Once it's legal for them to unionize, then they start to grow in numbers, right? So this is the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and you get industrial organizations like the United Mine Workers, the United Auto Workers, and they all come together under this umbrella organization, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, right? So what they did, it was started first by John Lewis. What they did is they helped to organize strikes, right? So we get a lot of strikes that are taking place prior to this being created. We had the West Coast strike all up and down Oregon, Washington, and California. The dock workers were going on strike, the longshoremen and the Teamsters went in with it, and it spread throughout the country. So there were huge strikes, and they were being put down by the police. Military was being sent in, and everything else. But then with the Wagner Act, they could go on strike. It became legal. Right, so things change. So what we're going to see as a result of that, the first time that a strike is really, really powerful is this one in Flint, Michigan. It's like December of 1936 to January of 37. And the guys normally, instead of picketing outside, they just sit down at work, right? And they refuse to do anything, or refuse to move or go anywhere. The business owners, GM tries to evict them. They turn off the heat. They send in the National Guard. But the governor of the state kind of sided with the workers, and so the National Guard just kind of was there to protect the workers. So everything changed, and they kind of hung on. And other car companies around the country, they increased wages because of what was going on here. And then, so GM was forced to increase their wages too, right? And as a result of this and the success they had, then they start to get more and more people join into the Congress of Industrial Organizations and all the different units that are part of it, like the United Auto Workers, right? So there were 4 million members by 1940, including 200,000 African Americans who were also working in these industrial cities as well, right? The CIO and then also the United Auto Workers was seen as the main bargaining power for their workers. All right, then another breakthrough for labor. This is the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is the first time that we're going to get a national minimum wage, right? And then also maximum work hours a week, which is 40, right? It also regulated child labor, which is you can't no children under the age. You have to be at least 16 to work, right? It did exclude agriculture, service, and domestic workers, though. So you know, if you're 14-year-old, your mom and dad can make you do chores on the farm. And later, though, certain things are going to change for like domestic workers and service industries, right? A lot of Black people, though, women and Hispanics weren't included in this. It wasn't enforced for them. All right, if you look here, this shows the results from that. Starting right here, the number of people in unions just increased substantially. Since that time, though, union membership has started to go down since the 1950s. Right, but it's not so much that it's gone down; it's that we don't have industry here as much anymore. Right, a lot of people who are unionized are in other industries; they're in the service industry. Right, and you can see this right here. So government, those are mostly the people who are involved in it. Construction, education. So the National Education Association. There are some that are in manufacturing, but see those manufacturing numbers have really gone down. Healthcare, all sorts of things, but we're mostly a service-oriented society now. We're an industrial society before. Okay, so that brings us to the election of 1936. There's a guy, Alfred Landon, the champ out of Kansas. He comes in, he says that deficit spending and the New Deal is leading us towards socialism. He loses by even a bigger margin than what Herbert Hoover did. FDR gets a huge victory in 1936. People wanted to stick with him. All right, so there is some opposition to the New Deal. People say there's this emergence of these demagogues, you know, like other people like Huey Long, the Kingfish, right? They appeal. Demagogue is somebody who appeals to people based upon their emotion or their prejudices, right? Some claim that the programs didn't go far enough, like I said at the beginning of the last chapter. Some claim that they had gone too far, right? And they took too much control and they increased the size of government too much. And then finally, a lot of people, they were critical of it, saying that it violated the Constitution. Okay, so this cartoon over here would be people who believed that the New Deal was violating the Constitution would agree with this cartoon. So I don't know if you know the story of the Trojan horse or not, but during the Trojan Wars, the Greeks made this like big sort of horse that they kind of gave to the city of Troy, right? But inside were Greek fighters, including Odysseus, right? So the horse was moved into this encampment, and then the Greeks could come out and attack. So this is kind of the same thing. So you got the New Deal tyranny going in to destroy the Constitution. So see, they're inside. Shh, don't let them know. So anyway, so conservatives were really concerned over the expansion of the government and everything that was going on at that time, right? So liberals were angered that maybe not enough had been done and the fact that people were still struggling. All right, here are some of these demagogues, right? Here's Father Charles Conklin, right? He would broadcast on the radio in Michigan, and he's a social justice. He talked about that. He said that there should be fair treatment and everybody should get fair share in society. He denounced Roosevelt. He says he's a tool of Wall Street. So apparently he thought that Roosevelt wasn't doing enough. Eventually the church kind of, tamped him down. And he blamed the Depression on Jewish bankers and on the communists. And then there's this guy, you guys have a video that you watched on him. This is Huey Kingfish Long, right? He was governor of Louisiana, and then he became a senator from that state. He was very powerful in the state. He was instrumental in getting roads built and kind of building up their infrastructure and helping people out there. But then he went on these speaking tours, and he had this belief. He said, we need to share the wealth. So basically, he pitted rich people, well, poor people against rich people, and saying these people should only have a certain amount of wealth. You should be limited on how much wealth you should be able to get. And then once you get that much, everything else should be taken away from you. And then that money is going to be redistributed to everybody else. He said everybody should get $5,000, to certain families. And then you should get an income of like $2,000 to $3,000 a year. You should have 1 month vacation a year. You should only work 30 hours a week. There were quite a few other, old age pensions, right? So he kind of went on college paid for, those sorts of things. So he was talking about that, and he gets a lot of support, not only from Louisiana, but throughout the country. And he was eyeing the presidency, but he went back to Louisiana. He was going to the Capitol or something, and an opponent of his, somebody, I'm not sure exactly why, but killed him, shot him right there by the Capitol. And then this guy here, Dr. Francis Townsend, he too was a huge critic of FDR. And I probably should have put this before, but it's because of him that we're going to get Social Security, right? He was a doctor from California, and he lost everything as a result of the Great Depression. He was old, right? Older. And he thought, we should give everybody an old age pension, right? So of $200 a month at that time. That would have been huge, right? It would have helped to have stimulated the economy. He says we could pay it through a sales tax. So do a sales tax on all items and then take that money and divert it to those people who are elderly and have no income. And this did influence Social Security in the creation of it. All right, so with all of this going on, FDR wanted to continue with his agenda, right? So if you look at the Supreme Court, they had ruled against him with the National Industrial Recovery Act, and then also with the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act in Butler versus the United States, and then the National Industrial Recovery Act with Schechter, or the sick chicken case. Right, so they ruled against him, and the court was pretty conservative. You got Brandeis, who was probably the most progressive. Oliver Wendell Holmes was on there, and Cardozo. I don't know what Cardozo's first name is, but anyway, they usually ruled a little bit liberally, but they were ruling against some of FDR's agenda. So part of the agenda, the Wagner Act, and also the Social Security Act was coming up. It was going through the appellate process, and it was going to be heard by the Supreme Court, right? So FDR wanted to ensure their passage. So he comes up with a scheme. So his scheme was, because there were people who were over, there's like 8 or 6 out of 9 of them on the court who were over 70. And he wanted Congress to pass a bill that said that every judge over 70, we should get another judge for it. I don't even know how you get your mind about this one. No, one new member for each member over 70 for a total of 15 new judges, right? And he tried what he could to get the support of Democrats. Republicans were obviously opposed to it, but the Democrats were too. They thought, well, this is really usurping the power. This is kind of a violation of the separation of powers, that the president's becoming too powerful, right? So he lost a lot of support from that. There was a lot of opposition. Even his own vice president was appalled by it, and so much so that he runs against Roosevelt in the 1940 nomination for the Democratic nomination, or running for the primary in the Democratic nomination, right? But so he lost a little bit at that time, but it was enough to kind of scare the court. And I think that well, after that, they ruled in favor of the legislation, including the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act. Okay, so on the left here, you can see that there's rising unemployment again in 1937. Things were kind of moving along, from 1934 on, the unemployment rate was going down, but it's still, it still is really high. 15%. And then what this thing that I circled here, this is what people started to call the Roosevelt recession, right? So unemployment was going back up about to 20%, right? If you look, the worst unemployment ever prior to the Great Depression was the Panic of 1893. And at that time, it got up to 18%. So it's still, the unemployment is still really high in the United States. You can remember, we talked about the Panic of 1893, how much they suffered then. Okay, so this is the unemployment rate. It goes from, 1929 to 1942. So again, this is a little bit more close up. It shows that employment rate had been going down, except for this little bump right here, right? And then here it goes up. Notice that it doesn't really start to go down again until World War II, which begins in September of 1939. And the American factories start gearing up to produce things for Europeans fighting that war. Of course, we're not going to get involved until 1941. All right, so because of the Roosevelt recession, Roosevelt starts listening to other people, and he employs Keynesian economics, right? So there's this guy, John Maynard Keynes. He's a British economist, right? There's a group of people that intellectuals that kind of hang out together, and he's among them. He advocated for the government to intervene on economic policies at this time and do deep deficit spending. So this encouraged Roosevelt to do this. So we're going to get the Reorganization Act of 1939, and it's really going to restructure the executive branch, and it is also going to give Roosevelt the power to operate on a budget that involves deficit spending, right? There's also civil service reform that is involved in that as well. All right, so if you look, this is the deficit spending right here. Now that looks bad, right? But it's nothing compared to now. So this is going to be, there was deficit spending during the Great Depression, but this really gears it up. And this really is more deficit spending for World War II, right? And then we recover from that pretty handily in the 1950s. And I can remember back in the 1980s, oh my goodness, people are just like, oh, the deficit, the deficit. Nobody screams about it anymore. But the deficit is really bad now. Let me see if I can get something else. I think there's one more. Here we go. This was from TARP, right? Troubled Asset Relief Program. This was from the deficit or the recession of 2008, right as Bush was leaving office and Obama was taking office. They did this huge package of spending, which is very similar to what they just did to aid businesses and unemployed as a result of the quarantine. But people were talking about that too. So spending, this is when we spend more than what we take in. Right. Also, at this time, look at taxes. Okay, when they were first imposed, Wilson raises taxes really high as a result of World War I, right? And then this right here is 1920, the Roaring Twenties. Hoover did this increase right here, and some economists think that that might have actually hurt recovery. And then this is going to be FDR, raising taxes here, right? And it stayed up there like 90% for a while. And this is only on those in the top tax brackets. And the thing of it is that revenues decreased even though taxes went up because people just didn't pay the taxes. And then what we're going to get, this is going to be the Kennedy tax cut right here. Kennedy said, well, we can't sustain this. And this is going to be Reagan's first tax cut right there. And then Reagan's second tax cut right there. So on average right now, for the highest among us, because we do have a progressive tax rate, the richest in our country pay like 34% of taxes, and then the poorest actually pay none. There's about 50% of the American people who don't have to pay federal income tax because they don't meet the minimum bracket for that. So the 50% do. All right, so let's look at some different groups. We always want to look at different groups within society during different periods of times. So there were actually gains made. We know that there were some significant gains made for labor during the Great Depression, somewhat for women as well. You see Frances Perkins standing right there behind FDR. She is the Secretary of Labor. First time that a woman was a cabinet member, right? So women are growing more prevalent, more important positions within society. So that's her. There's also in our government, Mary McLeod Bethune. She was a very close friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, and she served as the director of the Office of Minority Affairs, and actually the National Youth Administrator too. You can see that over there. And then on the other side, outside of this, she also organized. There's kind of this growing what becomes the Civil Rights Organization. We're going to get CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. That's going to be created in like 1942. But anyway, we get the National Council of Negro Women. Mary Bethune was an African American. Okay, and then women are also doing some other things. Ruth Benedict, she's an anthropologist. She studied cultures, right? And she wrote the book Patterns of Culture. The woman right here, this is an image. If you guys take sociology, it's in your sociology textbook. This woman is Margaret Mead. She went and she studied societies of the Pacific, right? And she kind of evaluated gender roles. Pearl Buck. She wrote the book The Good Earth, and she won a Nobel Peace Prize for Literature for that. So women were making strides during the 1930s. For Hispanic Americans, though, one horrible chapter in American history is Mexican repatriation. So what happened in many communities, especially along the border, but not just there, even in Illinois, this happened. People who had Hispanic origins were kind of rounded up. They would do something called the repatriation raids, right? Where they would go and basically take people, arrest them, and deport them and send them out of the country to Mexico. And a lot of these people, as you look right here, it's estimated that 60% of them were American citizens, either naturalized or born here in the United States. It's believed the majority of those 60% were actually born here in the US. They were first generation citizens. So if you look Spanish, we're going to round you up and we're going to send you to Mexico. And really what it was is that white people wanted jobs and resources to go to white people, right? Not to Hispanics. And as I said, it happened all across the country. Here you got a group of people. Where is this? Oh, it's in Los Angeles. 1,500 people are being expelled from Los Angeles and going back to Mexico. Some of them were maybe Mexican citizens that were being deported, but there were quite a few people who were Americans who were being basically exiled from their country. Okay, and Black people during the Great Depression really suffered. There was an expression, last hired and the first fired. So white people really pressured white business leaders that if you're going to hire somebody, hire a white person first, right? that sort of thing. Black people who were hired usually got paid lower wages. And if you look here, the black unemployment rate is estimated to be 50%. So that's double what it was for the country as a whole. But in some of these, and I looked, I couldn't find a chart where it showed anything definitive because they weren't keeping records of that at that time. But anyway, 70% of the people, black people of Atlanta were unemployed, 50% in Chicago, 60% in Detroit, right? One big change, though, was that black people had historically, they had voted for Republicans since the Civil War. Now, a lot of black people in the South couldn't vote, but people at this time, but people who were black who had gone from the Great Migration, they'd moved to the North, they could vote, right? And when they voted, they started voting for the Democratic Party instead of for the Republican Party for the first time. Okay, and as I told you, blacks oftentimes they were evicted from the land, from the Agriculture Adjustment Act, the first one, the second one, because government is paying farmers not to produce crops. And so if nobody has to work the land, then you need to kick the tenant farmer off. And so a lot of times then black people were found without sustenance, without a home, right? So they wandered the country. And then finally, there's this story, Marian Anderson. She'd been invited by Howard University, which is, remember the university that was created by General O.O. Howard? He headed the Freedmen's Bureau during the Civil War. But anyway, Howard University is the first historically black university in the country. And they invited her to come and perform. She's, I don't know, she's sang like opera, some sort of, I don't know. But anyway, um, she was invited to DC, and they were planning on her singing at Constitution Hall. Constitution Hall was controlled by the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is an organization to be a part of. You have to show that somehow you are related to somebody who was in the Revolutionary War. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of those women, but anyway, they refused to allow her there because she was black, and so the federal government, through Eleanor Roosevelt, arranged for her to speak right there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. About 75,000 people showed up to hear her sing. So it's quite moving. Okay, we are finished with chapter 33. Well, I am. You guys now have to take the video quiz and then take the quiz over this section. And then after this, you only have 34 and 35 left. Just 2 more chapters. Thanks for listening.